There are texts buried in the sands of time that threaten to unravel everything you think you know about Jesus, the Church, and the true nature of spiritual awakening. One such text, the Gospel of Philip, was not merely forgotten. It was silenced, hidden, suppressed, not because it was false, but because it spoke a truth too powerful, too liberating, and too divine to be controlled. Discovered among the mysterious Nag Hammadi scrolls in 1945, this ancient manuscript whispered of a Jesus unlike the sanitized figure of organized religion. A Jesus who taught divine union through knowledge. A Jesus who revered the feminine as sacred. A Jesus who revealed that the kingdom of heaven is not a distant realm in the sky, but a living state of consciousness waiting to be remembered within us. But why would such a message be banned? Because this gospel didn't preach obedience. It didn't serve empire. It didn't prop up institutions of power. Instead, it shattered illusions. It unveiled mysteries meant for initiates. It hinted at a sacred union between spirit and matter, between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, symbols of inner transformation and divine polarity. What you're about to discover in this video is not a conspiracy theory. It is a portal into forbidden wisdom, ancient gnosis, the kind of knowledge early mystics died to protect. We'll journey deep into the hidden history of the Gospel of Philip, decode its symbolic meanings, and understand why it was feared by the Church Fathers. By the end, you won't just see Jesus differently. You'll see yourself differently, because this is more than theology. It's a blueprint for awakening that was nearly lost until now. Are you ready to unseal what was buried? Then let us begin. To understand why the Gospel of Philip was hidden, we must first return to a time when Christianity was not yet a religion, but a revelation, raw, unfiltered, and revolutionary. Long before the cathedrals, the councils, and the canon, there were spiritual seekers scattered across deserts and mountains, scribes of divine insight who walked not by dogma, but by inner illumination. These mystics, known later as the Gnostics, did not see salvation as something granted through rituals or intermediaries. To them, salvation was gnosis, sacred knowledge, a remembering of the divine essence buried within the human soul. It was within these circles of awakened minds that the Gospel of Philip was born. Believed to have been written sometime between the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, this Gospel was not a narrative of events like Matthew or Luke. It was something far more dangerous, a mystical map, a collection of sacred insights, allegories, and esoteric teachings pointing toward the inner alchemy of the soul. It spoke of the bridal chamber, a sacred symbol of union, not between man and woman, but between the fragmented human and the divine whole. It hinted that true resurrection was not reserved for the afterlife, but was something that could occur here, in this lifetime, through awakening. But here's the paradox. While the Gospel of Philip radiated divine insight, it also challenged the rising authority of the Church. You see, in the centuries following Jesus' death, something began to shift. His radical teachings were being systematized, his metaphors literalized, and his spiritual path institutionalized. The early Christian movement, once diverse and mystical, was slowly being reshaped into a rigid hierarchical structure, one that required conformity to survive and dominate. By the time of the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, under Emperor Constantine, the Christian faith was being codified for empire. The emphasis was placed on authority, orthodoxy, and external salvation through belief in a specific historical narrative. Anything that contradicted this new model, especially writings that empowered the individual to seek truth from within, was labeled heresy. And so the Gospel of Philip was buried. Literally. It, along with over 50 other sacred texts, was hidden in clay jars and entombed in the Egyptian desert at Nag Hammadi, perhaps by monks or mystics who knew that the age of open gnosis was coming to a close. For centuries, these texts remained hidden, lost beneath sand and silence, until, as if by divine timing, they were unearthed in 1945, on the eve of a new awakening, when humanity began once again to hunger for truth beyond dogma. But beyond the politics and historical suppression lies a deeper question. Why was this knowledge so threatening? because it offered a path to divine union that required no church, no priest, no intermediary, because it honored the sacred feminine, a power the early patriarchal church sought to erase, because it revealed that Christ is not a man to be worshipped, but a state of being to be realized. This is the hidden context the Gospel of Philip reveals. Not merely a footnote in religious history, but a key, a lost key, to a much older spiritual tradition, one that sees the divine not as distant, but alive in every breath, every cell, every moment of awakening. And it is here, standing between history and myth, between exile and revelation, that we turn now to the very heart of the Gospel's wisdom. The Gospel of Philip is not a story, it is a mirror that reflects the hidden architecture of the soul and invites the reader to see beyond the veil of appearances. It doesn't hand out answers, it whispers riddles, paradoxes meant to awaken, not inform. And that is precisely why it was considered dangerous. But let us now peer into the heart of its forbidden wisdom. One of the most provocative and misunderstood passages in the Gospel of Philip reads, "The Lord did everything in a mystery, a baptism and a chrism and a Eucharist and a redemption and a bridal chamber." To the untrained eye, this might seem like obscure ritual language. But to the initiated, this is a map of transformation. Each of these words, baptism, chrism, Eucharist, redemption, bridal chamber, is not a ceremony, but a metaphysical stage in the journey toward inner union. They symbolize phases of purification, enlightenment, and divine integration. And the final stage, the bridal chamber, is the culmination of this path. It is the inner alchemical marriage, the union of the divine masculine and divine feminine within. Not between people, but within you. This is the central, radical message of the Gospel. Salvation is not external, it is internal alchemy. And in this, it stands in direct contrast to the theology developed by the institutional church, which positions salvation as a transaction, granted by an external Savior in response to belief and obedience. But in the Gospel of Philip, salvation is not given. It is remembered. It is unveiled through knowledge, gnosis. This Gospel also hints at another buried truth, the role of the sacred feminine in the ministry of Jesus. It refers to Mary Magdalene not just as a disciple, but as one who knew the fullness, one whom Jesus loved more than all the disciples and kissed often on the mouth. This was not the language of romantic scandal, it was the symbolic language of transmission. In ancient mystery schools, to kiss on the mouth symbolized the direct passing of spiritual breath, of sacred insight. Mary Magdalene was not a passive follower. She was a spiritual equal, a bearer of hidden wisdom, possibly even a priestess of the bridal chamber rites. Her presence in this gospel threatens the patriarchal hierarchy that rose after Jesus' death. And it reveals something even deeper, that the true teachings of Christ were never about blind submission to external power, but about the awakening of the divine spark within each soul, regardless of gender, status, or creed. And here we find ourselves at the threshold of understanding why this gospel was banned, not because it was false, but because it was too true. It didn't serve the agenda of empires. It didn't fit into neat doctrines. It couldn't be controlled, only experienced. And herein lies the essence of its mystery, because when we read the Gospel of Philip not with the mind, but with the Spirit, it begins to reveal itself, not as doctrine, but as a living flame. A blueprint for those ready to remember what the world worked so hard to make us forget. That we are not separate from the divine, that the sacred does not reside in temples of stone, but in the temple of the self, and that the journey back to this truth is not through belief, but through inner transformation. We've only begun to scratch the surface. To the modern reader, the Gospel of Philip may feel like a labyrinth of cryptic sayings and metaphysical poetry. But for those willing to sit in its silence and look between the lines, it begins to breathe, revealing truths that echo the deepest spiritual traditions of both East and West. One of its most enigmatic declarations is this: resurrection is not something that happens after death. If you do not rise in this life, you will not rise at all. This is no vague spiritual sentiment. It is a direct assault on the idea that salvation is a reward after death. In the eyes of the Gospel of Philip, resurrection is not a future event. It is a present awakening. This is the resurrection of consciousness. In ancient Gnostic thought, the dead were not those buried in tombs, but those asleep to their divine origin, trapped in the illusion of separation, chained to the material and emotional realm. Resurrection meant gnosis, waking up from the dream of ego and rediscovering the divine self. The institutional church taught us to look outward, for judgment, for reward, for redemption. But the Gospel of Philip speaks to those who dare to look inward, not to find guilt, but to rediscover the eternal light already burning within. And then there's this chilling line. Truth did not come into the world naked, but in symbols and images. It cannot be received in any other way. Why? Because ultimate truth cannot be spoken, it must be experienced. Like the Tao, like Zen koans, like the Sufi poetry of Rumi, this gospel speaks in riddles not to confuse, but to bypass the logical mind. It speaks to the heart's memory. It's no coincidence that mystery schools, both ancient and esoteric, operated in symbols. Why? Because symbols are alive. They penetrate deeper than language, unlocking dimensions of meaning the rational mind cannot touch. In Philip's gospel, every metaphor is a doorway. The bridal chamber is not about literal union, but the sacred marriage of opposites, of spirit and matter, of masculine and feminine, of higher and lower self. It echoes the mystical concept of hieros gamos, the divine union within that births a new being, awakened, whole, luminous. This idea terrifies structures of control. Why? Because a soul who realizes they are already divine, already whole, no longer bows to systems, intermediaries, or fear-based doctrines. But the Gospel of Philip doesn't stop at metaphysics. It also subtly rewrites the narrative of Jesus himself. To the authors of this text, Jesus was not merely a sacrifice for sin. He was a master initiator, one who came not to be worshipped, but to awaken others to their own divinity. His message was not, "I am the way, follow me," but rather, "The kingdom is within you, realize it." He was the key, but not the gate. The church replaced initiation with indoctrination. It turned an inner journey into an external hierarchy. It buried the feminine. It outlawed the mystical. It burned the gospels that dared to teach that you are not separate from God. And so the Gospel of Philip vanished. Until it didn't. In 1945, in the Egyptian desert near Nag Hammadi, a sealed jar was discovered, containing papyrus texts untouched for 1,600 years. Among them, the Gospel of Philip, a gospel buried to preserve its message, a gospel now rising like the truth it speaks of. Now we must ask ourselves, why are these texts resurfacing now? What dormant part of humanity is being reawakened in this era of chaos, control, and spiritual amnesia? Perhaps the return of the Gospel of Philip is not a coincidence. Perhaps it is a call to remember what we are, a call to rise, not in death but in life, a resurrection of awareness, a remembering of our lost inheritance. But to receive it, we must become like those ancient initiates, ready to strip away the illusions, ready to face the paradox, ready to stand in the presence of truth clothed in mystery. Ancient knowledge was never meant to be locked away in dusty scrolls or debated in sterile academic halls. It was always meant to be lived, breathed, and embodied. The Gospel of Philip is not just a theological curiosity, it is a mirror held up to the soul. And if something within you stirs as you engage with its message, a flicker of recognition, a quiet inner knowing, it means you are beginning to remember who you truly are. The core of Philip's message begins with awareness. Resurrection, in this context, is not an event reserved for the end of life. It is a daily act of awakening. Each time you interrupt your unconscious patterns, observe your reactions instead of becoming them, or choose presence over distraction, you are resurrecting your awareness from the tomb of forgetfulness. Simply asking yourself each morning, "Am I awake today?" can begin this sacred shift. One conscious decision made from awareness instead of habit is a seed that can grow into transformation. At the heart of this gospel lies the mystery of sacred union, what the text calls the bridal chamber. This is not a literal marriage or physical ritual, but a symbol of inner integration. Within each of us exists a duality, the intuitive and the logical, the mystical and the practical, the feminine and the masculine. True wholeness arises not from suppressing one half, but from embracing both. When you sit in silence, placing one hand over your heart and the other over your forehead, and allow both your feeling self and your thinking self to speak, you begin to reunite what has been divided. This alchemical marriage within becomes the foundation of inner harmony. Another principle woven throughout the Gospel of Philip is the understanding that truth hides in plain sight, clothed in symbols, metaphors, and paradoxes. The world is not random. Every event, person, and challenge you encounter carries a hidden teaching, waiting to be decoded. When you view life symbolically, it begins to reveal itself as a sacred text. A difficult relationship becomes a mirror, reflecting back the parts of you still unhealed. A recurring life pattern becomes a divine whisper, urging you toward growth. Each evening, reflecting on the deeper archetypal meaning of the day's events turns your life into a spiritual initiation. The Gospel also insists on spiritual sovereignty. While teachers and guides can illuminate the path, no one can walk it for you. The divine spark within you does not require permission to shine. You are your own mystic, your own priest, your own temple. By creating a small sacred space, perhaps just a lit candle and a moment of silence, you can reconnect to your divine origin without intermediaries. Speaking aloud the affirmation, "The kingdom is within me. I am not separate from the divine," helps anchor this truth not as a belief, but as an experience. Finally, the Gospel of Philip invites you into the art of sacred questioning. Instead of chasing quick answers, it teaches you to embrace mystery. Profound transformation begins when you ask the right questions, not with your intellect, but with your entire being. Questions like, "What in me is still asleep?" or "What am I afraid to remember?" open portals to self-discovery. When asked sincerely, these questions don't just generate answers, they initiate change. You don't need ancient languages or religious credentials to apply these teachings. What you need is presence, sincerity, and the courage to live as though you are already divine. Because in truth you are. What if the truths we've been searching for were never lost, only hidden in plain sight, waiting for eyes that know how to see? What if the Gospel of Philip was never meant to be understood by the masses, but remembered by the few, those whose souls were ready to awaken? As we peel back the layers of dogma, distortion, and historical censorship, we find not blasphemy, but beauty. Not heresy, but healing. The Gospel of Philip does not attack faith, it invites us to deepen it. It doesn't reject Christ, it calls us to experience Him, not merely worship from afar. It dares us to move beyond belief into being, beyond ritual into revelation. At the heart of its message is not rebellion, but reunion. Reunion with the divine within. Reunion between our fragmented parts. Reunion with the sacred feminine, the inner bride long cast aside by centuries of masculine dominance. It is not a gospel of opposition, but of sacred integration. And perhaps that is why it had to be hidden. For a world addicted to division, unity is always the greatest threat. But the time of forgetting is ending. The veil is thinning. The books once buried are now surfacing. The questions once whispered are now spoken aloud. You are not here by accident. If these words resonate, it means the ancient call has reached you. So now the question is no longer, why was the Gospel of Philip banned? The question is, what will you do now that you remember? Will you go back to sleep? Or will you step beyond the page and live the truth it was meant to awaken? The choice, as it has always been, is yours. If this message stirred something deep within you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it, reflect on it, explore further. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to this channel for more forgotten wisdom, ancient secrets, and practical paths to inner awakening. Because the journey has only just begun.